My brother-in-law leaned back in his chair, pointed his beer bottle at me, and laughed. "So what, you served coffee on base, right?" The room chuckled. I set my glass down. 30 seconds later, his retired Marine Colonel father looked him dead in the eye and quietly said, "Boy, apologize now." My name is Rebecca Lawson, and until that Thanksgiving I had spent almost 15 years making sure people underestimated me. If you'd passed me in the grocery store, you wouldn't have looked twice. I was 38 years old, lived in Virginia Beach with my husband Ethan, drove a 5-year-old Subaru Outback that always seemed to need another oil change, and worked as an aviation safety consultant for a private contractor near Naval Air Station Oceana. Nothing about my life screamed interesting. Honestly, I preferred it that way. That Thanksgiving fell on a cold Thursday in late November. Ethan and I left Virginia Beach just after 8 in the morning with a pumpkin pie balanced carefully in the back seat, and my homemade green bean casserole riding on my lap because Ethan insisted the roads around Richmond were full of potholes big enough to swallow a Buick. By the time we pulled into his parents' driveway a little after 11, every parking spot was taken. His younger brother Tyler had arrived before us. That wasn't surprising. Tyler liked being first. He also liked being the loudest person in any room. As soon as we stepped inside, I heard him before I saw him. I'm telling you, if people worked half as hard as I do, they'd stop making excuses. His voice carried through the house like a radio turned up too high. Linda, my mother-in-law, hugged me tightly. "I'm so glad you're here." "Wouldn't miss it." She took the casserole dish from my hands. Frank Miller, Colonel Frank Miller, United States Marine Corps retired, walked out from the kitchen drying his hands on a towel. He gave me one of his quiet smiles. "Rebecca, good to see you, Colonel. I've told you for years to call me Frank." "I know. You still won't." "No, sir." He laughed softly. Frank had always been different from the rest of the family. He listened more than he talked. He never bragged about Vietnam or Desert Storm or his decades in uniform. If someone else brought it up, he'd answer politely and move on. I respected that, maybe because I understood it. Most people imagine veterans spend every conversation talking about their service. The ones I respected usually did the opposite. Dinner started around 1. Turkey, ham, sweet potatoes with toasted marshmallows, homemade rolls. Enough pie to feed half of Richmond. Tyler was sitting across from me. His wife Melissa sat beside him, scrolling through her phone whenever he launched into another story about work. He sold medical equipment. Every holiday somehow became a speech about his latest commission. Halfway through dinner, he noticed the small Navy veteran pin on my sweater. "I forgot you were Navy." I nodded. "Yep. What did you do again?" "Oh, a little of this and that." He laughed. "No, seriously. I flew." His eyebrows lifted. "I thought women mostly handled support jobs." Linda shot him a look. "Tyler, what I'm asking." I shrugged. "I was an aviator." Really? He grinned like he'd already decided I was exaggerating. "So what, you served coffee on base, right?" A couple cousins laughed. Melissa looked embarrassed. Ethan stopped cutting his turkey. I reached for my water glass, took one slow sip, then placed it carefully back on the table. "Try again." Tyler leaned back. "Oh, come on. I'm serious." "So what did you actually do?" "I flew." "No." He smirked. "What was your real job?" I could feel every pair of eyes drifting toward us. Family gatherings always seem to do that. One loud voice pulls everyone into a conversation they weren't planning to join. He chuckled again. "Then what did you do in the Navy?" I answered exactly the way I'd answered questions for years, calmly, without raising my voice. I was a TOPGUN instructor. The room went completely silent. Not movie silence. Real silence. Forks stopped moving. Someone set down a spoon. Even the football game playing in the living room suddenly sounded louder. Tyler burst out laughing. "Oh, that's a good one." Nobody joined him. I wasn't looking at Tyler anymore. I was looking at Frank. His expression had changed in a way I'd never seen before. Not anger. Recognition. He slowly folded his napkin, looked directly at his son, then spoke in the calmest voice imaginable. "Boy." Tyler kept smiling. "Apologize." "Dad, she's kidding." Frank didn't blink. Now, the smile disappeared from Tyler's face. "What? You heard me." "Dad," I said, "apologize." Nobody moved. Linda looked back and forth between them. Melissa quietly whispered, "Tyler." He laughed nervously. "Seriously?" Frank looked at me. "Rebecca." "Sir, I have one question." "Okay. Were you ever assigned to Fallon?" I held his gaze. "Yes, sir." He nodded once. "That was all." No dramatic reaction. No speech. Just one slow nod. Then he looked back at Tyler. "You have absolutely no idea who you're talking to." Tyler frowned. "Dad, she can't seriously expect us to believe." Frank interrupted him. "I said apologize." For the first time since I'd known Tyler, he looked genuinely unsure of himself. He glanced around the table, hoping someone would rescue him. Nobody did. Instead, every eye slowly turned toward me. I suddenly wished they hadn't. Because this was exactly why I almost never talked about my years in the Navy. Not because I wasn't proud. Because once people knew, they stopped seeing the person sitting in front of them. Everything changed. And somehow I had the sinking feeling this dinner was only the beginning. Nobody spoke for several long seconds. Tyler looked around the table as if he were waiting for someone to laugh with him again. Nobody did. He forced a grin. "Dad, seriously, you're acting like she's some kind of war hero." Frank calmly reached for his iced tea. "I didn't say that." "Then what are you talking about?" Frank looked at me instead of answering. "I think Rebecca deserves to enjoy Thanksgiving without having to defend herself." I appreciated that more than he probably realized. I smiled politely. "It's all right." "No," Frank said quietly. "It isn't." Tyler threw up his hands. "Oh, come on. She says she was a Top Gun instructor, like that's supposed to impress everybody." "I didn't say it to impress anyone," I replied. "You kinda did." "No." "You could have just said you were a pilot." "You asked." I asked because I figured there was an actual answer. Ethan finally spoke. "There was." Tyler rolled his eyes. "Oh, please." Melissa nudged her husband under the table. "Enough. I'm just saying." Linda stood up and started gathering empty plates. "Who's ready for pie?" Everyone understood what she was trying to do. Change the subject. Normally it would have worked. Not this time. Tyler leaned toward me again. "So what did you teach which button starts the coffee machine?" Melissa closed her eyes. "Oh my gosh." I let out a slow breath. Not because his joke bothered me. Because I knew exactly where this kind of conversation usually ended. Someone demanded proof. Someone else accused me of lying. Then I either embarrassed everyone by answering questions they didn't understand, or I stayed quiet and let people think whatever they wanted. I'd chosen silence for years. It had made life easier. At least until today. Frank placed his fork on the table. "Tyler, what? If you had any idea what you're talking about, you wouldn't have made that joke." "Then explain it." Frank shook his head. "It's not my story." He looked at me again. "You don't owe anyone an explanation." I gave him a grateful nod. "Thank you." Tyler leaned back with a laugh. "Convenient." Nobody answered him. The conversation finally drifted toward football, grandchildren, and Christmas shopping. But the warmth that usually filled Thanksgiving dinner never really came back. Something had shifted. Not because I'd revealed anything extraordinary. Because people suddenly realized they didn't actually know me. Around 4 that afternoon, Ethan and I stepped outside to help carry folding tables into the garage. Cold air always feels different after you've spent hours inside a crowded house. Fresh. Quiet. For about 5 minutes, neither of us said anything. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. "You okay?" "I've had worse Thanksgivings." He smiled. "I believe that. I just hate making everything awkward." "You didn't." "I kind of did." "No." He stopped beside the garage. "Tyler did." I leaned against the Subaru. "You know what's funny?" "What?" "I spent almost 12 years trying not to stand out. And the one time I answer a simple question honestly, everyone thinks you're making it up." We both laughed. Not because it was hilarious. Because it was absurd. Frank found me a few minutes later. He was carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed me one. "Still take it black?" "I do." I remembered. We stood quietly in the driveway watching leaves blow across the street. Finally he spoke. "I owe you an apology." "You don't." "I invited my family." "So did Ethan." "They embarrassed you." "They embarrassed themselves." That made him smile. "I suppose that's true." He looked down into his coffee. "I recognized Fallon immediately, so I noticed. I spent several weeks there years ago during joint exercises." I nodded. "I remember Marines coming through." "I wasn't assigned there permanently." I figured. He looked at me carefully. "I also recognized your call sign." I blinked. "You remember that?" "I do." I hadn't heard anyone say that call sign in years. Not since I left active duty. For a second, I wasn't standing in suburban Richmond anymore. I was back in Nevada. Dry heat. Jet fuel. Dust blowing across the runway. The constant sound of engines. The endless rhythm of briefings, debriefings, simulations, and flights. Frank smiled faintly. "You probably don't remember me." I remember more faces than names. You were giving a lecture. I gave hundreds. You talked about decision-making. That surprised me. Not because I'd forgotten, because somebody else remembered. I wasn't even teaching Marines. No, but they invited observers. He laughed softly. I walked out thinking I'd just watched one of the best instructors I'd ever seen. I stared into my coffee. That was a long time ago. It was. I don't really think about it anymore, I figured. He hesitated before asking another question. Why have you never told the family? I answered honestly. Because every time people hear Top Gun, they stop listening. He nodded. They picture the movie. Exactly. Then they either think you're lying, or they treat you like a celebrity. And you wanted neither. No, I looked down the quiet street. I wanted to be Rebecca. Whoa. That evening, Ethan and I drove back toward Virginia Beach. The highway was unusually clear. Christmas lights had already begun appearing on front porches. The radio played old Eagles songs while Ethan drove. About halfway home, my phone buzzed, then buzzed again, then again. I think something's wrong, Ethan said. I opened Facebook. The first thing I saw was Tyler's newest post, a picture he'd secretly taken during dinner. Me sitting at the table with my water glass. Across the top, he'd written, "Family Thanksgiving just got hilarious. My sister-in-law claims she was a Top Gun instructor. Guess next year she'll tell us she trained astronauts too." A laughing emoji. 3 more underneath. The comments were already piling up. Some people never stop making stuff up. Sounds like stolen valor. Everybody knows women didn't do that. What a joke. Someone had already shared it. Then another. By the time we reached Williamsburg, the post had been shared over 80 times. I locked my phone and stared out the passenger window. The lights from passing cars blurred together. Ethan reached over and squeezed my hand. You don't have to deal with this tonight. I know. But deep down, I also knew Tyler wasn't finished. And for the first time in years, staying silent suddenly felt a lot harder than speaking up. I thought sleeping on it would help. It didn't. When I woke up Friday morning at 6:30, the first thing I saw wasn't the sunrise over our neighborhood in Virginia Beach. It was the glow of my phone on the nightstand. 23 missed notifications. I already knew why. Ethan was still asleep beside me, so I slipped out of bed, pulled on a sweatshirt, and walked downstairs. Our Labrador Daisy stretched, wagged her tail, and followed me into the kitchen. I started the coffee maker out of habit. Some routines are comforting even when nothing else is. While the coffee brewed, I opened Facebook. Tyler's post had exploded overnight. Nearly 3,000 shares, hundreds of comments. Some people thought it was funny. Others were downright cruel. Everybody lies on Thanksgiving. Another fake veteran looking for attention. She probably worked in the cafeteria. One comment bothered me more than the rest. Real military people don't have to brag. I stared at that sentence for a long time. The strange part was, I agreed with it. The problem was I hadn't bragged. I'd answered a question. 1 sentence. That was all. The coffee machine beeped. I poured myself a mug and tried to ignore the knot growing in my stomach. By 8 o'clock, my phone rang. It was my manager. His name was Greg. He'd hired me 3 years earlier because of my aviation background. Normally, he called only on Mondays. "Morning, Rebecca." "Morning." There was an awkward pause. I hate to ask this. Ask. We've gotten a couple emails. I closed my eyes. I figured. They're saying you fabricated your military experience. I didn't. I know. His voice was calm. But our clients are asking questions. I understand. You don't have to explain anything classified. I'm not allowed to. I know that too. He sighed. I just wanted you to hear it from me before rumors spread any further. I appreciate that. We're behind you. That sentence helped more than he probably realized. After hanging up, I sat at the kitchen table for several minutes. I wasn't angry. Not yet. Mostly I felt tired. I'd spent over a decade protecting information that wasn't mine to share, now that silence was being mistaken for dishonesty. By Saturday afternoon, the story had drifted beyond Facebook. Someone copied Tyler's post onto a local veterans discussion page. Then another. Soon, strangers were arguing with complete confidence about a woman they'd never met. One retired Navy chief wrote, "If she's telling the truth, people ought to leave her alone." Another replied, "Nobody becomes a Top Gun instructor without proof." Someone else posted a clip from the movie Top Gun. That one collected hundreds of laughing reactions. The internet has a strange way of making complete strangers feel like lifelong experts. I tried ignoring it. Really, I did. Instead, I walked Daisy along the boardwalk near the ocean. The December wind was sharp enough to sting my face. Families pushed strollers. Older couples held hands. Fishermen stood quietly on the pier. Nobody there knew anything about Facebook. It was peaceful. For almost an hour, I convinced myself the whole thing didn't matter. Then my phone buzzed again. Melissa. Hi. I'm so sorry. It isn't your fault. I told Tyler to delete the post. And he said everyone deserves a laugh. I wasn't surprised. He doesn't understand what he's doing. I know. She hesitated. I don't think he realizes people actually believe him. They do. I'm embarrassed. You don't have to apologize for him. I wish he'd listen. So do I. After we hung up, I looked out across the Atlantic. The waves kept coming, completely indifferent to Facebook. Sometimes, nature is a good reminder that our biggest problems aren't actually very big. Unfortunately, human beings don't always work that way. Monday afternoon, there was a knock at our front door. When I opened it, Frank stood there holding a paper grocery bag. I was in Virginia Beach. You drove 2 hours. I've made longer trips. He stepped inside. I brought apple cider donuts. I laughed. That's one way to get invited in. He smiled. I thought so. We sat on the back porch while Daisy rested at our feet. For a while, we talked about ordinary things. Football. The weather. His tomato garden. Finally, he leaned forward. I need to tell you something. I'm listening. I checked. I frowned. Checked what? Your service record. I stared at him. You what? I didn't pry. He shook his head. I used the same public verification available to any veteran. Oh. I wanted to make absolutely certain before I said another word to Tyler. And he looked almost offended. And exactly what I expected. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Then he said something that stayed with me. You know why I recognized your call sign. I assumed it was coincidence. It wasn't. He looked toward the yard. Years ago during a joint training conference, I heard Marine pilots talking. I waited. They weren't talking about themselves. They were talking about an instructor who never raised her voice. A faint smile crossed my face. I remember that. They said she could point out mistakes nobody else noticed. I looked away. I wasn't perfect. No, he nodded. That's exactly what they admired. I felt unexpectedly emotional. Not because he was praising me, because those years had felt so distant, like another lifetime. Frank reached into his jacket pocket and handed me a folded piece of paper. What's this? A program. I unfolded it. Veterans Day Community Honor Banquet. Hosted by the Richmond Veterans Alliance, Master of Ceremonies. Tyler Miller? I looked up. He's hosting. He volunteered months ago. I almost laughed. The irony. It gets better. Frank's eyes twinkled. He plans to give a speech about honoring veterans. I shook my head slowly. You can't make this up. I've already spoken with the event committee. That caught my attention. You what? They invited me to say a few words. I looked at him carefully. What are you planning? I'm planning to tell the truth. I don't want a spectacle. Neither do I. I don't want him humiliated. Frank gave me a long look. Rebecca, yes, there's a difference between humiliating someone. He paused. And allowing them to face the consequences of their own choices. I couldn't argue with that. Because deep down, I'd been wrestling with exactly that question. Part of me wanted Tyler to feel what I had felt. The embarrassment. The doubt. The frustration of having strangers decide who you were. Another part of me hated the idea of public revenge. That wasn't who I'd spent my life trying to become. Frank seemed to read my thoughts. You don't have to say a word. I don't. No. What do I do? He smiled. You show up. And then, let him introduce himself. For the first time since Thanksgiving, I smiled without forcing it. Because I realized something, I didn't need to prove who I was. Tyler was about to prove exactly who he was. Veterans Day arrived on a bright Tuesday with the kind of crisp November air that makes every American flag seem to snap a little harder in the wind. By 9 that morning, I had already decided I wasn't going. Then I changed my mind. Then I changed it again. Ethan found me standing in our bedroom staring into the closet. You've been looking at the same 3 jackets for 10 minutes. I know. Still thinking about staying home, I nodded. This isn't my kind of thing. I know. I hate public attention. I know. He smiled. I've been married to you for 12 years. I laughed despite myself. What if this turns into a circus? It might. What if people think I'm trying to embarrass Tyler? Ethan walked over and took both my hands. Rebecca. Yeah, you didn't create this. I looked down. He did. That was the sentence I needed to hear. Not because it erased my doubts, because it reminded me where they belonged. The Richmond Veterans Alliance banquet was held at the American Legion Hall just outside downtown Richmond. I'd been there once years before for a charity fundraiser. It wasn't fancy. Brick building, large meeting room, long tables covered with white cloths, American flags in every corner. Photos of local veterans lined the walls. Coffee brewing in giant stainless steel urns. Homemade desserts donated by volunteers. It felt exactly like hundreds of community events I'd attended over the years. Real people. Real service. No Hollywood. By 6 o'clock, nearly 300 people had filled the hall. Veterans from Vietnam, Desert Storm, Iraq, Afghanistan. Their spouses. Children. Grandchildren. Several local reporters stood near the entrance interviewing guests. I kept my head down. Frank had reserved seats near the back, exactly where I wanted to be. Tyler hadn't noticed us yet. He was too busy shaking hands, laughing, walking from table to table with a wireless microphone clipped to his jacket. He looked completely comfortable, almost proud. Melissa spotted us first. Her shoulders relaxed. She quietly slipped over. "I'm glad you came." "I almost didn't." "I'm glad you changed your mind." She hesitated. "He still doesn't think he did anything wrong." I sighed. "I figured." "He thinks everyone's forgotten about Facebook." I looked across the room at Tyler. "No, they haven't." The program began with the Pledge of Allegiance. Then a high school choir sang the national anthem. An honor guard presented the colors. The room stood in respectful silence. Everything felt sincere. Exactly as it should. Tyler walked onto the stage wearing a dark blue suit. He smiled into the microphone. "Good evening, everyone. Tonight we're here to honor the brave men and women who've served this great country." Applause filled the room. He continued confidently. "We should always respect our veterans because sacrifice deserves gratitude." I looked down at my hands. The irony wasn't funny anymore. It was sad. He spent nearly 10 minutes talking about integrity, character, honor. The words sounded polished, but every sentence reminded me of that Thanksgiving dinner. Then, halfway through his speech, his eyes found me. For just a second, surprise flashed across his face. Then he smiled. "There are even a few family members here tonight." Several people turned toward our table. Tyler chuckled. "I suppose military stories are always a little bigger around Thanksgiving." A handful of uneasy laughs drifted through the room. I felt Ethan tense beside me. I gently touched his arm. "It's okay." Tyler kept going. "You know how families are." This time, nobody laughed. Not even politely. He seemed to notice. His smile faded slightly. He cleared his throat. "And now I'd like to invite my father, retired Marine Colonel Frank Miller, to share a few remarks." Frank walked to the podium without any notes. No dramatic music. No theatrical pause. Just the slow, steady walk of a man who had spent decades speaking only when he had something worth saying. "Good evening." His voice carried easily across the room. "I'll keep this brief." He smiled. "My wife says that's the first miracle you'll witness tonight." The audience laughed warmly. Even I smiled. Frank knew exactly how to put people at ease. He spent several minutes thanking volunteers and recognizing local veterans by name. Then his tone changed. "There is something personal I need to address." The room became still. At Thanksgiving, someone in my family made unfair assumptions about another veteran. No names, no accusations, just facts. They questioned her service without knowing the first thing about it. I felt every heartbeat. Frank continued. "I served in the Marine Corps for 33 years. He paused. "I learned something important." He looked slowly around the room. "The loudest voice isn't usually the most experienced." Silence. "I verified the facts before speaking tonight." He carefully chose every word. "I will not discuss classified assignments. I will not discuss operational details. But I can tell you this." He looked toward my table. "Rebecca Lawson served honorably. She earned qualifications that very few aviators ever achieve. And she later instructed pilots entrusted with some of the most demanding responsibilities in naval aviation." He smiled slightly. "I know what those words mean. So do many people sitting in this room." For a second, nothing happened. Then a man near the front stood up. Gray hair, navy blazer, gold pilot wings pinned above the pocket. He looked directly at me. I knew that call sign. Another veteran stood. So did I. Then another. Within moments, half a dozen retired aviators had turned toward me. One older captain walked all the way across the room. He stopped beside my chair, extended his hand. "It's been a long time, ma'am." I recognized him almost immediately. "Tom?" He laughed. I was hoping you'd remember. You still owe me a perfect landing." The room burst into genuine laughter. Tom turned toward the audience. "I flew with students she trained." He shook his head with admiration. "You don't forget instructors like that." Applause began quietly, then spread. More people stood. Soon the entire room was on its feet, not cheering wildly, not shouting, just honest, heartfelt applause. The kind that means something. I felt my face grow warm. I wanted to disappear. Instead, I simply stood and nodded. Nothing more. Across the stage, Tyler looked as though the floor had vanished beneath him. One reporter quietly walked over and asked him a question. Another held up a phone displaying the Facebook post. He didn't answer. Melissa lowered her head. Frank stepped away from the microphone. His job was finished. He hadn't attacked his son. He hadn't humiliated him. He had simply replaced a lie with the truth. Sometimes, that hurts far more. Tyler slowly removed the microphone from his jacket. Without saying another word, he walked off the stage through a side door and disappeared into the hallway. No one followed him. For the first time since Thanksgiving, the room wasn't looking at me because of a rumor. They were looking at me because the truth had finally caught up. The banquet ended a little after 8. People gathered in small circles around the coffee tables, catching up with old friends and swapping stories that only veterans seemed able to tell. There wasn't much talk about me anymore, and I was grateful for that. A few people came over to shake my hand. One retired Navy commander thanked me for my years of service. A Vietnam veteran told me he appreciated the way I'd handled myself. "You never tried to make it about you," he said. "I didn't want it to be. I could tell. That meant more to me than the standing ovation ever could." Recognition fades. Respect lasts. Tyler never came back into the banquet hall. Melissa found me just before Ethan and I left. "I'm sorry." "You've already apologized." "I know." She looked exhausted. "I just wanted you to know this isn't who I thought I'd married." I wasn't sure how to answer. People are complicated. One terrible decision doesn't erase every good thing they've ever done. But it also doesn't erase the damage. "I hope he figures that out," I finally said. "So do I." She hugged me before walking away. The drive back to Virginia Beach felt different from the drive home after Thanksgiving. That night, I'd stared out the window wondering whether silence had been a mistake. Tonight, Ethan and I mostly enjoyed the quiet. About halfway home, he glanced over at me. "You okay?" "I think so." "You don't sound convinced." I smiled. "I'm relieved." "But I don't like seeing family fall apart." He nodded. "I know. I never wanted Tyler humiliated." He humiliated himself. "I know." He reached over and squeezed my hand. "You gave him every chance." I thought about Thanksgiving. Frank had asked him to apologize. Melissa had asked him to stop. I had stayed quiet. Instead of letting it go, Tyler had taken it online. Every step after that had been his own choice. That realization finally lifted something I'd been carrying for weeks. 3 days later, Tyler's Facebook page disappeared. At first, I assumed he'd simply made it private. Then Melissa texted Ethan. He had deleted every post connected to Thanksgiving. Every joke, every meme, every comment. The apology came a week later. Not online. Not through a lawyer. Not through Frank. He showed up at our front door on a rainy Saturday morning. I almost didn't answer. When I opened the door, he stood there alone, holding nothing but a folded umbrella. He looked older somehow. Not physically, just tired. "Can we talk?" I stepped aside. "Come in." Ethan stayed in the kitchen while Tyler and I sat at the dining room table. For almost a full minute, neither of us spoke. Finally, Tyler looked down at his hands. "I've practiced this speech 100 times." "You don't need a speech." He nodded. "I know." Another silence. Then he took a deep breath. "I was wrong." I waited. "I thought you were exaggerating." "I wasn't." "I know that now." His voice cracked slightly. "I also thought making jokes would make people laugh." "They did." "Yeah." He rubbed his forehead. "Until they didn't." I didn't rescue him from the silence. Some moments deserve to breathe. I've spent my whole life trying to be the smartest person in every room. He gave a sad little laugh. "Turns out I wasn't even close." I could hear rain tapping softly against the windows. Tyler looked at me. "I embarrassed you." "You did." "I hurt your reputation." "You tried." He nodded. "I deserve that." Then he said the one sentence I hadn't expected. "I embarrassed my father." I thought about Frank standing calmly at that podium. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't insulted his son. He'd simply chosen honesty over loyalty to a bad decision. "I think that's what bothers me the most," Tyler admitted. He looked disappointed. He was. I've never seen that expression before. No parent wants to. His eyes filled with tears. I wish I could take it back. I believe you. You do. I do. He looked surprised. I don't think you're an evil person, Tyler. I'm not sure I believe that this week. I think you got caught up in being right. I always have to be. You don't. That sentence hung in the room for several seconds. Finally, I smiled. I'm willing to move forward. You are... Yes, but... He nodded before I finished. I have to earn back trust. You do. I understand. We stood. For a second it felt awkward. Then he held out his hand. Instead I hugged him. Not because he'd earned forgiveness in one conversation. Because everyone deserves the chance to become better than their worst mistake. Life slowly returned to normal. Christmas came. Then New Year's. Frank called more often than he used to. Sometimes we'd spend an hour talking about airplanes. Sometimes we'd spend an hour talking about absolutely nothing important. Both conversations were equally enjoyable. Tyler changed too. Not overnight. Real change never happens overnight. He became quieter, more willing to listen, less interested in being the center of attention. Months later, during another family dinner, someone asked me about flying. Before I could answer, Tyler smiled. If Rebecca wants to tell the story, she'll tell it. Then he changed the subject. That small moment told me more than any apology ever could. He had learned. Looking back now, I realize my revenge wasn't exposing Tyler. It wasn't proving I had been telling the truth. It wasn't hearing strangers applaud. The real victory was refusing to let someone else's opinion define my own worth. For years, I'd believed staying silent was always the stronger choice. Sometimes it is. But sometimes, allowing the truth to stand on its own is just as important. If there's one thing I hope you take from my story, it's this: never assume you know someone's life because of a title, a uniform, or a first impression. The quietest person in the room may have walked a road you'll never fully understand. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this story reminded you of someone who earned respect without asking for it, I'd love to hear about them. Until next time, take good care of yourself and don't be too quick to judge the people who choose humility over attention.